to think that I would fall for a fat, bold egotist like you!
Fat? Me? Me? How have you known that my figure is the height of fashion?
The great healer demands you dead!
Well, if that's what he wants, then get him to do it himself. I'm busy.
If I am to gain his favour, I have to kill you!
Get on with your work, random people working for me. Now, look, Tessenbeaker, I
hate you!
She's killed me. She's killed me. Jobel. She's killed. Jobel.
What have I done?
Exterminate!
Hang on a moment. I just killed him. Didn't you see?
No, we came to exterminate you on the orders of Davros after we witnessed you attempting to help and warn Jobel after you were ordered to kill him, which you did not. Obey the Daleks.
But I've killed him now. I did what you wanted. He rejected me, so I went through with it.
Even so, you originally intended to help Mr. Jobel, despite being ordered otherwise. You were ordered to kill him. You should have killed him. You should have killed him immediately, not attempted to help him.
You're a real piece of shit, you know that?
It does not matter that you killed him after he rejected you. You initially disobeyed Davros's strict order. You shall be exterminated for that. Exterminate! Not fair. Not fair. Correct. Daleks are not fair. Right, I'm off. Enjoy the review, folks.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Nick here. Now, recently I went to see Doctor Who Revelation of the Daleks at the BFI, which was to promote the Season 22 Blu-ray box set coming up soonish. With showing the episodes and a couple of extra features and having a bit of a chat about it. Ben also went and whilst he didn't go and see the episodes, he did meet up with us later. And we made a little video on the Whoniversals channel whilst waiting in line to get some stuff signed, which you can check out now. I got my DVD signed by Colin Baker and Nicola Bryant and Colin Spell. He played one of the characters in this story, as well as also Mr. Crane from The Rise of the Cybermen and the Age of Steel in Series 2. It was incredible to go and see a Doctor Who story at the BFI on the big screen. This was so great. It was great hanging out with Ben and later also Will and a couple of other people as well. So great, and the signing was great. But we're here to talk about the story. So, how is this story? Well, the plot of Revelation of the Daleks sees the Sixth Doctor and Peri arrive on the planet of Necros to go and visit the Doctor's friend Arthur Strangos, who has recently passed away. So they're going to the funeral home he is at, Tranquil Repose, on the planet Necros. But when they get there, they start to investigate some mysterious goings-on around the planet, although it does take them pretty much the entirety of part 1 to actually get there. Yeah, this is probably the worst case example of Season 22's The Sixth Doctor and Peri take a long time to get from the TARDIS, or they're in the TARDIS quite a while, to where the main focus of the story is going. This is probably the worst example of that. But on the plus side, this does allow us to flesh out quite a few supporting characters throughout the story. First of all, we are aware that the great healer of Necros is in fact Davros, and he is trying to turn, as it's revealed later in part 2, he's turning the bodies of the deceased or the cryogenically frozen into Daleks. He's turning them into Daleks. These are mostly richer persons who have passed away, whilst the more poorer ones are turned into a protein resource, a food for the galaxy to combat famine. This allows Davros to get a bit of a profit alongside that of the factory, say the head of the factory. Carla, played by Eleanor Barron, if I remember that right, is the head of this factory thing who's supplying the food across that Davros is making across the universe, and she's making the money out of that, but Davros is taking quite a lot of money out of her. So she and her secretary guy hire these 2 assassins to try and kill Davros. Whilst this is going on, the people at Tranquil Repose are preparing for the funeral of the president's wife, or a president's wife. They are led by Mr. Joe Bell, who is played by the actor who plays Mr. Copper in Voyage of the Damned, and his student Tassan Maker, who has an unrequited love relationship with Mr. Joe Bell, who is an otherwise self-obsessed, egotistical womanizer. However, the one person he is not interested in is Tassan Maker. We are also introduced to the heads of security, one of which is played by Colin Spundle. The other one is called Mr. Tarker, not the actor, the character. And they're basically these really tough, rough characters who head security in the first episode, and then later on try to overthrow Davros and succeed. More on that later. We're also introduced to Natasha and another guy, can't remember his name, but they are basically body snatchers, quote unquote. But really, Natasha is Strangos' daughter, and she is looking to find out what they've done with the body. So they're trying to investigate what's going on there, but they cause a little bit of a stir in Tranquil Repose and eventually get captured by the security guys. And Colin Spundle's character is really brutal in the torture of the male body snatcher character. He force feeds him the alcohol that the male body snatcher had to calm his nerves, and he force feeds him down that, and then later he beats him the fuck up whilst he's drunk. He can't speak, and he's really angry and beating him up. Jesus, this episode, this story is dark. This is quite a nasty story. How did it earn the PG rating? I suppose the violence not too bad. I suppose it's alright for an under 12 audience. But good grief, this is a dark, dark story. And on top of all that, we've also got the assassins Orsini and his squire Bostov, who have been hired by Carla and her secretary to go and assassinate Davros, basically. I think I've got all of the double acts in this story. We've also got a DJ character. And if I have a criticism about the tone of the story, it's that the DJ character, sometimes we intercut to his scenes at times where it doesn't feel like it's a good time to swap to go from, let's say, for example, Natasha discovering her father is being turned into a Dalek, to the DJ having a funny comment, and then switching back to Natasha and her friend seeing Strangos as the Dalek. We're going from a pretty dark scene, and then we have some sort of light comedy in there for a moment that doesn't actually really motivate the plot that much, and then we're back to that dark moment we just were at. So some of the scenes, they don't really flow the tonally, but it's really great to see the DJ fighting against the Daleks, helping Perry in episode 2, and using his music as a way to help defeat the Daleks. And it's also interesting that he inspires his DJ persona on American DJs from the 1950s and 60s. Going back to the tone, however, I do think this is a good example of Season 22's tonal issues. Season 22 is infamous for being a dark series in the show. Apart from Mark of the Rani, this series has and also Time Lash, but there's a lot of dark stuff going on across this story. This one, and Vengeance and Varus especially. But there's quite a bit of there's quite a bit of dark moments throughout this series. There's also quite a bit more violence in this series. Again, apart from maybe Mark of the Rani and Timelash to a lesser extent, but quite a few of these season 22 stories are quite dark and violent, and this story is pretty much a definition of that. But at the same time, it's probably one of the more campier and sillier series of 82, considering there was a pretty good balance throughout Peter Davison's run. But once we got to Colin Baker, it went too dark or too silly at the same time. Now, going back to the DJ interrupting the moment that Strangos's head is found by Natasha, and his body's being turned into a Dalek. This is supposed to be a very serious story, but yet we got bits of this story does have quite a bit of comedy in it, but we got bits of stuff like the DJ interrupting and so forth, and it does kind of undermine some of the tone a bit in this story. Some of the darker stuff is being undermined by the sillier stuff, and there has been some campy stuff throughout this series and also next series, and some bits of the Sylvester McCoy era into undermining some of the darker moments, and especially in this season it feels a bit odd. Before he watched this series, my friend Ollie Pajak considered this part of the show campy land, and even after watching the episodes he still considers this more of a campy part of the show's history. It's very, basically still in campy land, despite the dark and edgy stories scattered throughout the Sixth Doctor's era, and yet for him to still say there's quite a bit of camp in some of the darker stories of the show. Probably the darkest point of the darkest stories of Classic Who, alongside many of the Philip Hinchcliffe era episodes and maybe some early Graham Williams ones. For him to still say we're in campy land after watching these episodes, yeah, this season's got a tonal problem. It's the same problem with Delta and the Bannerman, a story that I love but the fandom seems to hate, bar a few exceptions, where it doesn't really know whether it wants to be a fun, rollicking 1950s adventure story or a serious assassins chasing down this Shimron princess story, and it just doesn't quite work this together. The difference with Delta and the Bannerman is that the former element of that allows people like me who actually like the story to have a bit of fun with that. Well, a lot of fun, actually, in my case. But it allows us to have quite a lot of fun. In the case of Revelation of the Daleks, I don't think this is as bad as some of the other stories that have done the camp and the serious and camp stuff together. I think this one is definitely quite dark and allows it to be a more serious story. But it is those moments of silliness or maybe too much comedy, that maybe that's why some people, such as my friend Ollie Pajak, consider this part of the show to be Campyland territory. That being said, I think Revelation of the Daleks does handle its serious tone stronger than, say, maybe Attack of the Cybermen, The Two Doctors, and especially Timelash. Oh, but in fact, Timelash is probably why this story is so dark, because that was so campy. Okay, probably not. But in all seriousness, this story is still pretty damn dark and gruesome. I already mentioned the torture scenes, but there is still quite a bit of violent moments throughout the story. Quite a bit of nastiness. Quite a few characters die in quite nasty ways. Besides extermination, we've also got Tassenbeaker stabbing Mr. Joe Bell with a syringe into his chest. Bostoff shoots Davros's hand off. That's why he's got the claw in the new series. He's got the claw hand, and also that claw hand on the front cover of the Juggernauts and Terra Firma covers. Actually, no, that's the not the Terra Firma one. That's the Dalek Emperor design. But on the Juggernauts one, he's got kind of a claw hand, and also some of the Big Finish Time War ones, he's got his claw hand. But basically, any story set after this, he's got a claw hand or metal hand, because he got shot off. This is the story where it got shot off. Heck, even the toy box, the collection of toys tie in with this episode, released in the late 2000s, early 2010s, included a swappable hand with a tissue with green blood on it option. That was really cool. In a similar way to Joe Bell, Orsini stabs Carla with a small, long don't know if I could call it a knife, maybe a barbecue tong that into comes in and out. But he basically stabs her for betraying him because she gives him a set to contact them, but really it's a bomb that will blow all of them up. But when Davros brings her to them, she then has to reveal herself, which then leads to Orsini killing her for betrayal. The rest of the deaths are extermination, I believe, besides the mutant who Perry whacks with a stick, and then there's nice moments where he just talks with her and the doctor, and then dies. And there's this bit where Perry's like, "Oh no, I killed him, and he was so nice. Why did he have to be so nice about it? He forgave me." And the Sixth Doctor is actually quite reassuring. You didn't have a choice. He was attacking me, so you whacked him, and whatever happened to him, it clearly hasn't made his life very easy. So you've actually helped him. They're there. It's all right, Perry. It's all right. We're friends. We're good friends by this point in the series. Let's hug. Oh goodness! Imagine if they had hugged. Oh, that would have been nice. That would have been nice, actually. But speaking of the Doctor and Perry, because there's so much going on with the supporting characters, they themselves don't get a lot to do. As mentioned earlier, they're basically taking the long way to get to Tranquil Repose in episode 1, and they don't really get into the actual buildings until shortly into episode 2 after the cliffhanger. And the Sixth Doctor doesn't really do that much in the story anyway. Doesn't really integrate much of the action. He helps out where he can, here and there. He helps the Body Snatchers escape. He helps Susini and Bostoff, well, eventually get Davros' hand shot off. He helps get get him, Perry, and the security people out of the Davros' lair and back upstairs so Orsini can blow everything up with the aforementioned bomb. But he doesn't really have an awful lot going throughout this story. And like with Resurrection of the Daleks and Davros could have succeeded with this plan if they just hadn't involved the Doctor at all in this. It doesn't really make sense why they even want the Doctor. Davros wants him for what? Well, probably to kill him, but that's about it. He lures the Doctor to this trap, and it doesn't really go anywhere. The Doctor didn't actually have to be in this story. For once, this could have been a Doctor-like story. It's actually Mr. Tarkus and Colin Spundle's character who actually get rid of Davros by calling the Daleks from Skaro, because Davros is building his own Daleks who would be loyal to him in the story. So they call the Daleks from Skaro to arrest Davros and take him back to Skaro to stand trial for crimes against the Daleks. And they take the Daleks he's created that haven't been destroyed to go with them to be reconditioned, and they would have done the same with the embryos being created down on Tranquil Repose if Orsini hadn't blown the area up. This is part of the cog that leads to the Dalek Civil War in Remembrance of the Daleks. But it does feel like there is some parts of this trilogy of Dalek Civil War stuff from Resurrection, Revelation, and Remembrance of the Daleks, respectively. It does feel like there's some parts of the story missing that Big Finish and books and other media have to fill in the gaps for. It's not just the Doctor who has a bit of a raw deal in this story, characterization-wise. The Daleks feel like grunts at this point. This is probably the weakest the Daleks have been written in the classic series after Destiny of the Daleks, because the Destiny of the Daleks, they made them robots. I don't know why, but Douglas Adams just took Terry Nation's script and decided to turn the Daleks into generic robots with some organic life forms. Okay, after Destiny, this is the weakest the Daleks have been portrayed in the classic series, because they just act like grunts in this story. I think Eric Sayward did a better job of writing them in Resurrection of the Daleks, because they were the ones orchestrating the plan. But in this story, the Necros Daleks just feel like grunts, and the other ones just come in to capture or destroy them. Like with Day of the Daleks, they're probably the least interesting part of this story, and it's a Dalek story. This is the one and only Sixth Doctor Dalek story. Yeah, it's got expanded media Dalek stories, but in terms of the television series, this is it. So it's a bit of a shame that neither Doctor nor main villain, well, I guess you could say Davros is the main villain of this story, but okay, Daleks didn't have to be in this story. It could have been Davros versus the people of Tranquil Repose and Necros. Regardless, the performances are excellent across the board from our main and supporting actors. I will say it's probably Roy Skelton and Royce Mills weakest Dalek voices, at least in a while, considering how great they were in Genesis of the Daleks, a good 10 years prior. The Dalek voices in Genesis were fantastic, and the 60s Dalek voices were amazing, but during the early 70s and 1980s, they weren't quite as great. And I'm actually glad they stayed pretty consistent throughout the new series, thanks to Nicholas Briggs's outstanding Dalek voices. Oh well, at least the Dalek voices in this story are nowhere near as bad as the ones in Day of the Daleks and Frontier in Space. But all the other actors are really great. They do really great jobs. Colin Baker is brilliant as usual as the Sixth Doctor, and he and Perry have a really great relationship in this story, and Colin and Nicola Bryant have a great chemistry together. Terry Malloy is having a blast as Davros. He is having so much fun, and our main supporting characters are also really brilliant. So much great acting across the board. These characters feel like realistic characters throughout this story. It is pretty dang great. On a direction side, I think this is Graham Harper's weakest directed Doctor Who story, and I hate to say that because he's one of the best directors of the show, but yeah, this is not one of his. This is probably his weakest directed stories. He directed Caves of Androzani just a year earlier, and that was brilliant. And he would direct so many great episodes in series 2, 3, and 4 of the new series. But here it doesn't quite work as great. More so on a visual level. The cinematography of this episode can feel a bit stinted and doesn't quite work as well. There is a couple of great moments, like when we have this shot of the corridor and when we go down 3 levels. That looks pretty cool. And there's a couple of interesting shots, but there's a couple of other shots that look a bit stinted. And I don't know if that's to do with television at the time being a little bit stinted, or if this particular direction doesn't quite work as well as Caves of Androzani or some other stories around the time, let alone the new series stuff. And I think Graham Harper would relish in how the new series episodes he directed would look. He would relish in that. Whilst here, it does kind of look a little bit flat. And yeah, it is 1980s television compared to 2000s television, but even compared to Caves of Androzani, and when you had some great shots there, including when the villain Morgius would turn to the camera like a Shakespearean actor and speak to the audience. This episode's cinematography just feels a little stinted, which is a massive shame. Editing-wise, it's edited really well, but again, there's a couple of questionable edits, just like with the editing, and like with some other classic series stories, cutting from one scene to another scene, then going back and forth a little bit too much, or not really deciding whether to focus on one scene or another, and just kind of doing a bit of both, as opposed to focusing on one then another. And it's not exactly like if they're happening at the same time, like say something in Flux or Eve of the Daleks recently, where you had some stuff happening at the same time as another bit of stuff. So we focused on one bit first, then we went to see the other bit, even if they happened at the same time. But we still kind of focused on one bit at a time. Here we just seem to be back and forth, and it doesn't even feel like they're happening at the same time. They just feel like we're just going from one part of the episode at one time to another part at another time. I feel like part of episode 1 of Snake Dance is a good example of this, where we're cutting back and forth between stuff in the TARDIS and stuff on the planet, and it's not necessarily happening at the same time, but it's just showing that they don't know whether to have the scene on the planet with the supporting characters or the scene in the TARDIS with the main characters. They can't seem to make up their minds. And I feel like that's one of the issues both here and with many other classic Who stories. Mostly 70s and 80s stuff, 60s not so much, because they didn't really do that too much, and when they did go back and forth, it usually worked in the scene, like in Planet of Giants, when they realised they were only an inch high. It actually worked well when they were cutting back between the Doctor and Barbara and Ian and Susan talking and in 2 different places at the same time. It actually works there. So yeah, I'm not sure why, but 70s and 80s Who could sometimes just go back and forth from scenes, not even said at the same time, and just not really sure whether to focus on one or the other and just keep cutting back and forth for a bit. Production design, Tranquil Repose has some great sets and there's some great location work in this story. Some pretty brilliant visual effects, apart from, I noticed this time around when watching the story on the big screen, the Dalek that kills Natasha and her friend is supposed to be levitating, and this was supposed to be the first story where we saw Daleks levitate, but the way it's shot and edited doesn't really make it look that way. It just looks a bit awkward. This is probably why Remembrance of the Daleks is considered the first story where a Dalek flew. And even then, people thought, oh, maybe it was a hovering device or something. No, it definitely flew in that story, but maybe they thought it was on a hovering device. Oh well, since 2005, we all know Daleks can go upstairs, after all. So overall, Revelation of the Daleks is a pretty great story, but I wouldn't say it's a great Dalek story, considering the way they're treated. But it is a pretty strong Davros story, and it's a pretty great way to end off Season 22 and wrap up the Sixth Doctor's first series. And a pretty dark, but also fun story in its own right. It has a couple of production difficulties and script issues, but on the whole, it is a pretty great story. I will be giving this story an 8 out of 10. So yeah, this is a pretty good story. Do check it out. It is quite dark and gruesome in places, but on the other hand, you've got the DJ to lighten stuff up and a couple bits of comedy. In fact, the screening that week I went to had quite a few funny moments in it that we members of the audience laughed at or had a chuckle at. There was quite a bit of funny moments. But yeah, that was Revelation of the Daleks, and ended on the Sixth Doctor promising Perry that they would go on holiday too, and it was supposed to be Blackpool. They cut that moment out because they were going to save it as a surprise for the start of season 23, which would have taken them into the Nightmare Fair. Oh boy, the Nightmare Fair. That sounded like a great episode from the documentary that was talking about season 23, the original season 23 they were planning, and from the description of the audio, Big Finish audio synopsis, this sounded like a really great story. And season 23 might have even been better than season 22. Wow, audiences must have been really excited to see season 23 after this season. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case, because during the broadcast of the two Doctors, the BBC, or rather Michael Gray's controller of BBC One, decided to cancel Doctor Who after the 22nd season had finished. Following outcry from the production team and the public, Michael Gray backtracked and said, oh no, it's just going to go on hiatus for 18 months. But when the show did come back, the original planned season 23 was not made. Another season 23 was made. 14 25-minute episodes, almost half the length of season 21. Season 22 was 13 45-minute episodes, half as many episodes but twice as long as before. So the season 23 we would have gotten would have been the same format, but the season 23 we got went back to the 25-minute format, but only 14 episodes, almost half the length of season 21. So the initial stories were not made. Instead, a brand new story was constructed as a parallel to what was going on with the show, with the programme itself being on trial for its own existence. Eric Saywood, the script editor, and producer John Nathan Turner decided that they would reflect this in the story of this 14-part epic they were constructing. The next time we will meet the Doctor and Perry, it won't be at Blackpool Beach. Instead, the Doctor will be on trial for his very life. The trial of a Time Lord begins. But not for us, because we have come to the end of this video. Some of you are probably thinking, fucking finally. All I've got left to say is thank you so much for watching this review of Revelation of the Daleks. Hope you enjoyed, and Thomas will see you next time in a video about...